starting to get quite hoarse, but by about the middle of the talk, my voice had gone completely. And I can just remember a hall full of young people killing themselves laughing when I was trying to describe Josiah and his monster of a father. And that was really the best I could do. So hopefully that won't happen again tonight. We should have our voice all the way through. It's a bit of entertainment. Sadly, serious subject, but there you go. What can you do? Well, it's quite a simple idea that we're looking at here with the cities of refuge. It's the idea of sanctuary or asylum. And that word probably sounds familiar because it's constantly in the news, isn't it? We're constantly debating as a community and as a society what we should do about asylum seekers. In international law, in fact in the law of Australia, there's a concept that if somebody is escaping a serious threat to their life or to their well-being, then they can seek asylum. They're legally permitted to do that by international law, and to come to Australia and to ask for the door to be opened so that they can find safety and a better life here for themselves and for their families. Back in the 70s, I can remember I was just a little kid then, but there were boat people coming to Australia all the time displaced by the war that was going on, particularly in Vietnam, but it was also affecting Kampuchea and Laos as well. And they were welcomed with open arms, resettled in Australia. In fact, they're the drivers of new industries here today. A lot of the farmers I speak to on the Northern Adelaide Plains are the children of those boat people who were welcomed into Australia. But times moved on. We're a lot more insecure about our identity today, and I think a lot less community-minded and a lot more selfish. And so the community debates whether it should even open the door to people who are knocking on it today. Well, we might come back to that a little later on tonight, but this concept of sanctuary or asylum or refuge, here's where it began with the cities of refuge in Numbers chapter 35. So it's an ancient institution. Moses is giving these laws to the children of Israel in about 1500 BC. And so here we are about 3,500 years later, and we have this concept of asylum or sanctuary or refuge in the news every day. What can we learn? What can we do to help? Well, that's something we'll come back to. But let's start by trying to get a handle on what these cities of refuge are all about. Well, here we have Israel really, as it says in verse 1 of chapter 35, the Lord spake to Moses in the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho. So think about, if you put yourself in the sandals of an ancient Israelite and think about where you are, you're on the banks of the Jordan, looking across the river. You can perhaps see the city of Jericho in a distance, and you're thinking, wow, it's just there, isn't it? My inheritance is just across the river. I can't really wait to take myself and my families into the land of promise. And while we're sort of camped there, waiting for a few final things to happen, God is making some final arrangements with Moses. Those arrangements is, well, first of all, in the first 8 verses of this chapter, 8 cities for the Levites. Now, I'm pretty sure you know who the Levites were. We're not going to take a lot of time on this, but they were the tabernacle and later the temple servants, weren't they? A whole tribe in Israel who was dedicated to the work of God in some way. They became the scribes of Israel down the track. And God arranged to place them in cities throughout the tribes of Israel, distributing them throughout the land, seeding the nation, if you like, with cells of dedicated people who could set an example of what it meant to love God and to serve him with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And as it turns out later on, 48 cities were dedicated in verse 7 to settling the Levites throughout the land. But then we pick up the story from verse 9 because God moves on to talk about a new concept. And this is the places of refuge for the slayer or the manslayer. Now, have a look in verse 9 then. The Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye become over Jordan into the land of Canaan, then ye shall appoint you cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the slayer may flee thither, which killeth any person at unawares. So now that's a pretty important distinction, isn't it, right? Which killeth any person at unawares. This has got to be an accidental death, as it says on the screen. So we're talking about an accidental death, or what we would call manslaughter in terms of our legal system today. So in ancient Israel, justice today, if you set out to kill somebody with what is called in law a mens rea, or a guilty mind, you will be convicted of murder. But if you killed somebody and that was not your intention, it was an unfortunate accident or an act of stupidity rather than intent, you pushed someone, they fell backwards and hit their head on a stone wall, for example. Or an industrial accident, you were working together out in the field and something went badly wrong. Well, in that case, you'll be convicted of manslaughter, and of course that's quite a different thing. There's been a death. That's very serious, and it will be recognised by the courts, but it's quite a different thing from murder. Now, under the law given by Moses, murder was a capital offence, but who would enact that? Well, getting justice was the responsibility of the family or the tribe, and the avenger would be a near relative who would be responsible for hunting down the guilty party and executing justice by killing them. And that's what it talks about in the next couple of verses. Well, verse 12. These cities of refuge shall be unto you cities for refuge from the avenger. Notice that term. That the manslayer die not until he stand before the congregation in judgment. So we've got the manslayer, the person who in some unfortunate way has been responsible for this unintended accidental death. They probably feel awful about that, but of course now they're under threat of their own life. And we've got the avenger who represents justice for the family or the tribe, who's responsible for hunting them down and killing them. Now, even with our modern courts, people can be wrongly convicted. It's not common, but it does happen. In fact, it's fascinating that with access to DNA technology today and forensic science, we're able to go back and revisit some cases and some convictions, and we're finding that there are, in the big scheme of things, a small number, but I'm sure they feel strongly about it, hundreds of people who've been wrongly convicted and imprisoned. They're not guilty of what they've been accused of. They might have looked guilty, and all the facts might have appeared to point to them, but when we get the hard evidence of DNA, we know that we got it wrong. And that's why we set such a high bar for conviction. In a criminal trial, you have to have somebody convicted beyond reasonable doubt, because as a society we believe that it's much better for a guilty person to get away with something than for an innocent person to be wrongly convicted. And so we deliberately set the bar high, and that does mean that some guilty people get away with their crimes, but even so, some innocent people will be wrongly convicted, even today. Well, imagine back in this tribal society, 3,500 years ago. They don't have access to the resources we have in our modern legal system, do we? It's very primitive. There's no police force. There's no detectives. There's no forensic science. There's no public prosecutor. There's no prisons, there's no judiciary, there's no courts. So none of that is there. So how will justice be done? There's a high chance that innocent people will be killed for something that was not their fault. And if that's the case, of course, you're potentially setting up a cycle of revenge killings and blood feuds that could go on for generations. And so God very wisely put this institution of the cities of refuge in place, which were designed to protect the innocent and to act as a circuit breaker for these potential blood feuds. And so in verse 12, God says, they shall be unto you cities of refuge, or a safe haven, where the manslayer, the person guilty of unintentionally killing another person, could find refuge until his or her, I suppose, case was tried by the city elders, which was their closest equivalent to a court. And there were 6 of these cities initially anyway, verse 13. Of these cities which ye shall give, 6 cities shall ye have for refuge. Ye shall give 3 cities on this side Jordan, and 3 cities shall ye give in the land of Canaan, which shall be cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall be a refuge, both for the children of Israel and for the stranger, no difference is made, and for the sojourner among them, that everyone that killeth any person unawares may flee thither. Okay, so you get the idea. Now, the next few verses, as Elliot read this through, you would have noticed from verse 16 onwards, God runs through a series of cases. What about if they killed them with an instrument of iron, like a sword or a knife? Or what if it was like a stone axe? Or what if it was a club? Doesn't make any difference, says God. If they set out to kill that person by whatever means, that's murder, and they are guilty. And this framework of safe haven or refuge or asylum or sanctuary is not for them. This is only for people who have accidentally killed someone. And so it says in verse 22, if he thrust him suddenly without enmity, or have cast upon him anything without laying of weight, or with any stone wherewith a man may die, seeing him not, and cast it upon him that he die, and was not his enemy, neither sought his harm. So just think about the kinds of situations that might involve. You might be working with a friend, for example, pulling down a wall. Maybe it's a house that's derelict and you want to rebuild it. And the wall comes down on top of them and they're crushed. Right? You'd be feeling dreadful about that, but you are responsible logically, because you were there and part of that situation, for their death. Or you're working to cut down a tree together or shift a massive log, and they might be hurt or crushed. You throw away a rock off the side of a cliff or something and it accidentally hits somebody down below. Or you're chopping wood and the axe head flies off and cuts somebody in the head. That's the kind of situation that God envisages. And in these situations, the manslayer was protected. So they had to run to the city of refuge. In verse 24, the avenger had to come before the court and they would have to tell the story as they saw it. The person who was responsible for the death would get to explain what happened from their point of view. And in the end, there would need to be witnesses and their stories would have to stack up, and that's why had to be 2 or 3 witnesses, because you could take them apart and quiz them separately and make sure they're not colluding. And in the end, then, the congregation would decide who was the guilty party, and they would impose a penalty. I guess at an extreme, if they found the person guilty of deliberately causing death, then they might be executed. So it's quite a serious matter, and it would be done very carefully and thoughtfully, I'm sure. Now, if it's found that the death was accidental, the manslayer gets protection. So have a look at verse 25. The congregation shall deliver the slayer out of the hand of the revenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to the city of his refuge, whither he was fled. Right? He gets to stay in this safe haven. And he shall abide in it unto the death of the high priest, which was anointed with the holy oil. Now, it goes on to explain the verses that follow that if he left the city and left that protection, so the city itself, and then there was a bit of land around it which stretched about half a kilometre in each direction, so a reasonable distance. I guess it's where all the market gardens and the allotments and things like that would be. If he went outside that boundary, he was exposing himself to death. Right? If the manslayer was sort of camped out there, waiting for him to sort of get complacent, he could lose his life. So he had to stay within the city and its bounds. And we're also told that once the high priest died, notice at the end of verse 25 how it says, unto the death of the high priest, which was anointed with the holy oil, when the high priest died, he had to return home. And hopefully that was years away and passions had cooled, and he could be allowed to return home and go about his life unmolested. That's what he'd be hoping, wouldn't he? But, some people are very slow to let grudges go, aren't they? And it could be that they're still seething with anger years later about what happened, and that you're exposed to some risk going home. But that's what you had to do once the high priest had died. Okay, so everyone pretty clear about the law and the function of the cities of refuge in that framework to protect people who accidentally caused the death of another person. Now, these requirements are repeated in a number of places, but let's just have a look at a couple of details. Come over to Deuteronomy chapter 19. We won't go through it all in detail there. There's just an interesting couple of points. In Deuteronomy chapter 19, it talks about these cities of refuge again. It just reinforces the fact that when they get into the land and they inherit the land, they need to do what God asked and allocate these cities of refuge. And it says in verse 3, just have a look at verse 3. I'm not sure what translation you're using. I've got a King James Version open here. It says, thou shalt prepare thee a way. Now, you might like to compare that with what you've got on your lap. New Revised Standard Version says, you shall calculate the distances, right, which suggests, we want these cities pretty accessible, doesn't it? We want to be able to reach them fairly quickly if we find ourselves in that terrible situation. In a footnote, the New Revised Standard Version has, you shall make roads to them, right, which it's another layer against that you were to deliberately create a network of roads that would make it easy to get to these cities. English Standard Version is similar. So I'm not sure what you've got there, but it might give you one of those options. You have to think about why that is. Why did God tell the Israelites to calculate the distances or, according to another interpretation, make roads to these cities? Well, it's God's grace showing through, isn't it? He understands the grief and the pain of the bereaved family and their passion for justice. But he's doing everything he can to save the life of somebody who had no evil intent. It was just one of those terrible accidents. And in fact, in verse 10, just glance down to verse 10, you'll see he describes it as innocent blood. So we might think, well, they're guilty. They've caused a death. But God says, yes, but they didn't intend to. And he describes it as innocent blood in verse 10. And in fact, he says in the verses that come between verses 4 to 9 there, he says, if the land grows in size, and I suppose that means, people would be living further and further away from these cities, he says, add some more, add 3 more cities. So it was always God's intention to make it as easy as possible for people involved in such a terrible situation to get to one of these cities as quickly and as easily as possible so that the whole situation could calm down and a fair trial could be conducted and the right outcome obtained. So that's the arrangement. Now come over to the book of Joshua now, and I don't have the chapter marked here. I think it's Joshua 20. So it's now we're across the Jordan now, and the conquest of the land has been concluded, and Israel is settling into their inheritance. And God nudges Joshua in verse 1 and says, Joshua, it's about time to remind the children of Israel to put this arrangement in place. And God says, they can decide where the cities are. I don't mind. But they must go ahead and pick some cities, the best system they can come up with, and identify them as cities of refuge and put this system in place. And that's exactly what Israel went on to do. And in verses 7 to 9, we're told what those cities were. So here's just a schematic of the land of Israel with the different colours representing the different tribes. Who's this big sort of yellow block here down in the south? Anyone know? Which tribe would that be? Judah, correct. Right, and here's Simeon, and here's Reuben up here, and so on. So, that's Manasseh and Ephraim and Benjamin. So there's all the 12 tribes of Israel have got their inheritances. Of course, there's one tribe that won't show up as a colour on that map. Which tribe's that? Levi, correct. Because the Levites had an inheritance in a sense. God said, I am their inheritance. But of course they needed somewhere to live, and so they got the 48 cities that were distributed evenly all the way through these other tribes. And as said in Numbers, the large tribes like Judah have to allocate more cities for the Levites, and the small tribes, and Benjamin was the smallest of all, had to allocate the least cities for the Levites. But everybody had to give something so that the Levites had somewhere to live all the way through the tribes of Israel. And then these large red dots are the cities of refuge, right? And you can see they've done exactly what God said, can't you? There's 3 on this side of the Jordan, 3 on that side of the Jordan. They're reasonably evenly spaced. These are closer together, I'm guessing because that's more difficult terrain. And so it takes longer to travel across this part of the land, and so the cities are closer together. But they've done really exactly what God said. And in fact, I found this map on the internet as well. Someone's calculated that if you ran, and it looks like about 20 miles, so that's quite a long day's running, but if you were running flat out to a city of refuge, this circle represents a day's journey from each direction. And you can see it doesn't cover the whole land, but it certainly does a pretty good job. And I guess if you're in one of these places, tough luck, you've got to run a bit harder. It's going to take you a day and a half, and you better get moving. But these cities are there, and they're pretty easily accessible from pretty much anywhere in the land of Israel, just like God intended. So, good system. And we don't have a record exactly of it being used, but of course that's not to say that didn't happen. There would have been real-life situations where people really needed this access, and we're very thankful to have this system in place. Now, actually, there is a situation in the Old Testament narratives which brings this principle to life. So, shall we have a look at it? It's quite a remarkable story, and in several parts. It's between two big egos. Joab, who was a nephew of David, a courageous warrior, and for most of his life, David's general, the chief of army, and Abner, who played a very similar role for Saul, the first king of Israel. So two very big egos, two alpha males, and the story really shows them going to head, and this system plays a role in what happened. So come over to 1 Samuel chapter 2. That's where the story begins. 2 Samuel 2, sorry. 2 Samuel 2. And we'll just see how not the cities, well, even that, I'm going to backpedal on that even, but we'll see how this principle of asylum or refuge or sanctuary played out in the story of these two powerful men. Now, this is a situation, of course, well after the days of Joshua. In 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 1, it came to pass after this that David inquired of the Lord. So we're now even 500 years after Moses instructed Joshua to put this system in place, 1000 BC approximately. Saul and Jonathan, of course, have been killed in battle with the Philistines, and the family of Saul have been all but wiped out. And David is about to be anointed king in Hebron. Hebron, remember? Hebron is one of the cities of refuge, and that plays a role in the story that follows. So just keep that fact in the back of your head. So in verse 1, David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said unto him, "Go up." And David said, "Where shall I go?" And he said, "To Hebron." So David goes up to Hebron, where he is anointed king by the tribe of Judah. Now, David wants to bring the whole nation together. He wants to unify them. And so he reaches out to the other tribes, but, verse 8, Abner the son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, took Ishbosheth the son of Saul and brought him over to Mahanaim, the other side of the Jordan, and made him king over Gilead and over the Asherites and over Jezreel and over Ephraim and over Benjamin and over all Israel. It sounds very impressive, but actually he's just Abner's puppet. And for all the territories that are listed there in verse 9, Ishbosheth lives in a small farmhouse in a country town on the eastern fringe of the nation. It's not very impressive at all. It's all just a front because Abner wants to hang on to power that little bit longer, and so he's got this puppet king. Now, Abner starts a fight with David. In verse 12, Abner the son of Ner and the servants of Ishbosheth the son of Saul went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. They launch a raid. And as they enter the territory of Israel, cross the river, Joab goes out to meet them. And the raiding party and Joab's troops sort of come together in Gibeon. A battle breaks out and Abner's forces are badly beaten. They turn and flee. Verse 17. There was a very sore battle that day, and Abner was beaten and the men of Israel before the servants of David. And Joab's troops, not content with putting them to flight, give chase. Right, so that's the kind of person Joab was. He was relentless. And once he had them on the run, he was going to hound them all the way to the river and across. Now, he's got a brother who's just as focused. In verse 18, his younger brother, Asahel. Right? Verse 18, there were 3 sons of Zeruiah there, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as light of foot as a wild roe. Right, so if he ran in the city to bay, he would have done 20 k's an hour. He's a very fast runner. And he spots Abner running away, and he thinks, wow, that's the big scout, the enemy general. I'm on to him. I'm going to follow him and see whether I can claim the big prize and really get a reputation for myself. It's all about egos. Well, Abner is an older man, a bit like myself, very tough, very fit, very fast. But Asahel is young and quick, and Abner can see that he's gaining on him. And ordinarily he wouldn't really care, but he doesn't want the blood of Joab's brother on his hands, because that will make the whole thing very personal. So he tries to discourage him. And while he's sort of running flat out, Asahel on his heels, I imagine he's flinging a few words of Hebrew back over his shoulder. And essentially this is how it works out in verse 19. Asahel pursued after Abner, and in going he turned not to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. He's just very focused, isn't he, right? He wants to claim the prize. His blood was up. Then Abner looked behind him, verse 20, and said, "Are you Asahel?" And he answered, "I am." And Abner said to him, "Turn thee aside to thy right hand or to thy left, and lay thee hold on one of the young men, and take thee his armour." But Asahel would not turn aside from following of him. So Abner's tried to discourage him, but he won't listen, will he? And Abner said again to Asahel, "Turn thee aside from following me. Wherefore should I smite thee to the ground? How then should I hold up my face to Joab thy brother?" Right? Back off, sunshine. But he won't listen. Howbeit, he refused to turn aside, verse 23. So Abner thinks, okay, well, I've got to take matters into my own hands here. And so we read the rather gory sequel in verse 23. Abner with the hinder end of the spear, which probably had a steel point on it, smote him under the fifth rib, that the spear came out behind him. That's incredibly hard to do. So it actually shows that Abner was a very powerful warrior indeed. He fell down there and died in the same place. And it came to pass that as many as came to the place where Asahel fell down and died stood still. So Abner lets him get up nice and close until he can just about feel his breath on his neck, and he thrusts backward with his spear and kills him instantly. It's awful. It's a terrible waste of a young life, and that is war. Never imagine, we can be a little bit distanced from it by, for example, a computer game. There's nothing glorious or romantic about war at all. It's blood, it's sweat and tears and Asahel's guts spilled all over the highway. It's ugly and it's stomach turning and it's a terrible thing. Well, it doesn't count as an accidental death, does it? But on the other hand, you could say it was a fair fight. Abner was running away and he did make 2 attempts to discourage Asahel. So you can hardly call him guilty of a crime either. Which is it? Sort of in the grey zone, isn't it? Well, let's have a look at, there's a sequel to this story. Joab lets it go for now, but he's one of those people who nurses a grudge for a very long time and he's not going to let this go. And so there's an unfortunate sequel to this story. Just come to the next chapter, chapter 3. Abner can see, after time goes by, went on for a couple of years, and Abner can see that this is hopeless. Right? We're not going anywhere here. We're going backwards. David's cause is advancing. The cause of Saul is hopeless. He falls out with his puppet king, Ishbosheth, and he decides to make a power move. He reaches out to David and he offers to help him become king over united Israel. Right? So it's a treacherous move, really. And what Abner's saying is, look, I'm powerful enough, I've got the connections, I can talk to these people, and I will persuade them to change their allegiance, come over to you, and that will make you king over all Israel. And so in verse 12, Abner sent messengers to David on his behalf, saying, "Whose is the land?" Saying also, "Make thy league with me, and behold, my hand shall be with thee to bring about all Israel unto thee." Well, Joab wasn't present at the time. He was out fighting David's battles. And when he found out that Abner had been and gone, that it was a big banquet and so on, he was furious because he hated Abner with a passion. And he's starting perhaps to feel also a little bit insecure about his own position. So he says in verse 22, "Behold, the servants of David and Joab came from pursuing a troop and brought in a great spoil with them." So they've been raiding their own people. "But Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he'd sent him away and he was gone in peace." So Abner's gone, Joab comes in, and people who were there in the city told Joab what had gone on, and he is absolutely furious. When Joab and all the host that was with him were come, they told Joab, saying, "Abner the son of Ner came to the king. He hath sent him away and he's gone in peace. What do you think about that, Joab?" Then Joab came to the king and said, "What have you done? Behold, Abner came unto you. Why is it that thou hast sent him away and he's quite gone? You know Abner the son of Ner, that he came to deceive you, and to know you're going out and you're coming in, and to know all that you do. Of course, David is quite unmoved. Joab storms out, but he's got a plan. When Joab was come out from David, he sent messengers after Abner, which brought him again from the well of Sirah. Who knows what Joab told him? But David knew it not. And when Abner was returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him quietly, and smote him there under the 5th rib, that he died for the blood of Asahel his brother. So this is a sort of medieval representation, not really a sort of a true-to-life photograph. Looks like a bad Sunday school play, doesn't it, really? But so this was Joab's plan, right? He hatched it with Abishai, and when he got Abner back in the gate of Hebron, the sanctuary city, within the borders of the city of refuge, that's where he assassinates him. And he just sort of slips in the knife when Abner is innocent, and he's dead. David was furious, but he felt there was little he could do other than himself publicly from the crime and honour Abner in his death. So that was that, apparently. But even that is not the end of the story. Come over to 1 Kings chapter 2, because Joab wasn't unlike Abner himself. He enjoyed playing these power games. And when David was elderly and people were starting to think about who would replace him as king, Nathan and Jehoiada and others supported David's choice, which was who? Who was David's choice for the king to come after him? Solomon, correct. But there were other options, because David had quite a few sons, and Joab wanted a puppet he could control, just like Abner had tried to control Ishbosheth, and so he backed another young man called Adonijah. And when the Adonijah party was outmanoeuvred by the Solomon party, Joab was a long way out on thin ice. He was really, he was living on borrowed time. And what we find it's worse for Joab than that, actually, because in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 4, we find that just like Joab hadn't forgotten, David hasn't forgotten either. He's got unfinished business. And while he didn't feel that he could deal with Joab, he says to Solomon, you really, or in justice, you ought to do something about Joab. Unfinished business. Verse 4, 1 Kings chapter 2. He says, verse 5 actually, that moreover thou knowest also, he says to Solomon, what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, and what he did to the 2 captains of the hosts of Israel, unto Abner the son of Ner. It's the incident we just read of, isn't it? And unto Amasa the son of Jether, another relative, whom he slew, and shed the blood of war in peace, and put the blood of war upon his girdle that it was about his loins, and in his shoes that were on his feet. Do therefore according to thy wisdom, and let not his hoar-head go down to the grave in peace. You need to do something about Joab, says David. And of course, by conspiring with Adonijah, Joab has given Solomon all the justification that he needs. And when Adonijah made another move, he tried to marry one of David's queens, Solomon decided it was time to break up the conspiracy once and for all. And so he executed Adonijah for treason, and Abiathar the priest was suspended and sent into exile. And what about Joab? Well, verse 28. Then tidings came to Joab, for Joab had turned after Adonijah, though he turned not after Absalom. And Joab fled unto the tabernacle of the Lord and caught hold on the horns of the altar. So he's clinging to the altar like that. And you see, what he's doing in his own way is seeking asylum, refuge, sanctuary. That's what he's asking for by clinging to these projections from the altar. That's symbolically what he's demanding. But he hasn't given that himself, has he? He hasn't respected that principle. Now he's sort of betting his life on it. Well, in verse 29, it was told King Solomon that Joab was fled unto the tabernacle of the Lord, and behold, he is by the altar, supposedly a safe place. Then Solomon sent Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, his executioner, saying, go fall upon him, right, kill him. Benaiah came to the tabernacle of the Lord and said unto him, Thus saith the king, come out. See, Benaiah respects the principle, doesn't he? He's not going to go in there and kill Joab at the altar. Out you come, Joab, your time is up. He said, no, but I will die here. Well, Benaiah doesn't know what to do. He brought the king word again, saying, Thus said Joab, and thus he answered me. And the king said unto him, Do as he has said, and fall upon him and bury him. Perhaps it was a mistake on Joab's part to use those exact words, no, but I will die here, because that's exactly what happened. And so Solomon makes a little speech here, that thou mayest take away the innocent blood. Notice that phrase. Where have we heard that before? Right, Deuteronomy 19 verse 10. The innocent blood of the one who was responsible for a death but not intentionally. Well, he uses the same phrase here ironically, doesn't he, of someone who was very guilty of deliberate murder. Which Joab shed from me and from the house of my father, the Lord shall return his blood upon his own head, who fell upon two men more righteous and better than he, and so on. And so he gives Benaiah the mandate to execute Joab. And in verse 34, that's exactly what he does, and he's buried in his own house out in the wilderness. So Joab doesn't forget, but neither does God. What we find all the way through the Bible, when God's justice comes, it's often poetic, as it is here. And so it's just a reminder, isn't it, to beware how we treat other people. It will come back to us in one form or another. And you know, the Bible reinforces this principle, doesn't it, repeatedly. Here's some words of David from Psalm 18. He's talking about God. And he's showing how God's justice balances. If we are loyal, says David, then God will be loyal to us. Right? God values loyalty. And so when he looks at us being loyal, right, sticking by a friend, even when they're in trouble or their reputation's been damaged or they have some real needs that have cropped up in their life because they're going through some challenging situation, God respects that. God looks at loyalty and he says, I like loyalty. I am loyal to loyal people, says God. And that's what David celebrates in this psalm. With the loyal, you show yourself loyal. Let's remember that, right? That the qualities that God respects and values, if we display them, God will show them to us himself. With the blameless, you show yourself blameless. Right? If we're not guilty of going around undermining or sabotaging other people, God respects that. With the pure, you show yourself pure. And with the crooked, you show yourself perverse. In other words, says David, for all these great promises that you've made, God, when you see people acting in a way which is inconsistent with those values and those promises, then you think, well, my promises are not for those people. I'm withdrawing those promises from those people and they will suffer the consequences. So let's remember what David has said here about God. Joab got what was coming to him. He had lived and treated other people. And we might recoil from the violence, the essential justice of what happened to him. Now, of course, in another way, and in a much greater way, really, this is how the Lord Jesus put it in Matthew chapter 7. It's called the Golden Rule, isn't it? And while you'll find similar logic on the lips of other great teachers like Buddha, for example, it's only Jesus who puts it in this positive way. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. For this is the law of the prophets. In other words, from the very beginning of time when God gave the law to Moses and when he reinforced that again and again through the prophets, this is the principle that God has enunciated. Think about the way you would like to be treated by other people and then make sure you are that kind of person. That's what the Lord Jesus said. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. Not necessarily as they are doing, notice, but as you would like them to do. Think about the way you would like to be treated in everything and treat other people in that way. And he goes on to say, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Those verses need to be put together because Jesus is talking here about the way of truth and love, and if we live that way toward other people, that's the narrow gate, says Jesus. Or the hard road, because not many people like to live like that. Most people choose to live a bit selfishly, don't they? They'll like the people immediately around them, family members, for example. They won't reach beyond that. Well, says Jesus, you need to walk the way of truth and love, but that is the way that leads to life. So make sure you treat others as you would like to be treated. So a powerful lesson there from that story. Now, what else can we learn from this remarkable institution of the sanctuary cities, the cities of refuge? Well, come over to Hebrews chapter 6, because there's a New Testament passage that deliberately alludes to this institution and applies it to us directly. It says, well, what's your refuge? Where should you go looking for a safe haven? And this is what the author of the letter to the Hebrews says. And he uses this very figure of a safe haven or a refuge, and he really brings it to life. Now, in verse 18, he talks about, just have a look at Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 18. He says, I'll explain, I'll come back to the logic of it in a moment, but just read from the beginning of the verse. By two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us. So see those words? Fled for refuge. And it's a deliberate allusion to what we've been talking about back in Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua. Fleeing for refuge. So think about what it's saying. It's talking about us as we are without God, isn't it? If God wasn't there, where would we be? Well, we're conscious, aren't we, often of being guilty. Conscious of thinking thoughts or feeling emotions or saying things or doing things that are not right. Conscious of being out of tune with God. And sin and judgment snapping at our heels, if you like. And we're in the situation of the for refuge in fact. And picture what that would be like for that person. Just think for a moment. Pounding, and their chest heaving, their lungs screaming for oxygen, their legs like lead, really trying to outrun that avenger. And all the time in mental and emotional agony because of the family they've left behind, and an overwhelming sense of guilt about the friend or neighbour for whose death they're responsible through some terrible accident. All of that going through your head and your heart while you're desperately running for safety. And then finally, the city is in sight. You redouble your efforts. One final desperate sprint to the gate, and you're safe at last. Relief, wouldn't there, at that moment, of finally having stepped into or run into a safe space, of freedom, of a huge weight lifting off your shoulders. You've got the opportunity now to calm down, to talk things through with people, to process your guilt and your fear, to explain what happened, cry probably, and get it all out of your system, receive forgiveness, make plans for the future. All of that becomes possible because you've got this second chance of life through having reached safety in this institution. The same again. You can't undo what happened. You can't bring that person back to life. But at least you can move forward with your life in some form because you've got this city of refuge. And what the writer is saying here is that we fled for refuge to the promises of God. They are that sanctuary, that asylum, that refuge for us. Now look at how he puts this. In verse 13, you'll notice, just look back a few verses to Hebrews 6, verse 13. He's talking about the promises to Abraham. Right? Now, I wouldn't mind betting that a lot of you have actually memorised those promises at some point or endeavoured to do so. Right? The Lord spoke unto Abraham, didn't he, and said, get thee out of thy family and from thy kindred and so on, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless them who bless you, and curse them who curse you. And in your seed, all the families of the earth. That's Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. And of course, through the life of Abraham, repeatedly God reaffirmed that promise until these words in verse 14, which are taken from Genesis chapter 22 toward the end of Abraham's life, where God said, surely, blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. The repetition in the verse is a Hebrew way of like double underlining, if you like. And God's saying, I absolutely guarantee, Abraham, I will bless you. I will multiply you and make you fruitful. That is what God is saying there in that promise. And of course, it was never just to Abraham, was it? Because in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. It was God's intention through Abraham to take his blessing to the world. And so what I'm saying here is that God has got a purpose with you and with me for good. He's got a purpose to bless us. He's got a purpose to make us fruitful, to meet our needs, to give us security and satisfaction and significance. That's what he's promising in that promise, and it's been extended to us as well. Now, how can we be sure about that? How can we really be confident that we can rely on God's promise? Well, God knows that we're riddled with doubt, and so in verse 17, look at what it says. God, willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, the fact that having once decided it, he will not change his mind. That promise stands, right? God's purpose sticks. He's not going to change his mind. And just to make it doubly clear, as if he couldn't have made it clear enough already in the words he's chosen, it says he confirmed it by an oath. In Genesis chapter 22, God says, by myself have I sworn that in blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. You think about what that means. So God has not just said he will bless us. He's thrown into the mix his infinity, his eternity, his limitless goodness and love and wisdom and power. He said, I'm going to throw all of that in to give you total confidence that I will fulfill my promise to you. We can absolutely trust him, says God. And we can absolutely trust his promise. And we can absolutely trust his purpose for good. And so it says in verse 18, by two immutable things, unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie. We don't often talk about things being impossible for God, do we? Right? Jesus said, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus said to his own Father, Father, all things are possible to thee. And it's pretty much true, isn't it? I mean, God's not going to do nonsense things, of course, like make 2 + 2 = 5 or anything like that. But God can do pretty much anything. And yet here it's saying, here's something that's impossible for God to do. He's made the promise, and then he's thrown all of himself into the mix as well to guarantee that promise. We can absolutely trust that promise because it's impossible for God to lie. When he says, I'm going to do it, he will do it. We can have a strong consolation or great encouragement who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us. That's what it's telling us. And so the writer is saying, go on, reach out, take hold of it with both hands and hang on for dear life. That is the promise, and it is there for you to grasp confidently. And then he uses a figure in the next verse. He says, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast. He's using a picture of like a boat in a storm, in fact. And it's worth perhaps sort of unpacking the picture in your mind to understand the power of what he's saying. Our life is often like that, isn't it? We're often washing with emotions like anger or fear or shame or bitterness or hatred, perhaps, or grief or frustration or stress, often in crisis. Our moods shift all the time. That's a picture of what we're like without God. In fact, I found this other picture of, I think this was taken off Christmas Island, that tragic accident when a boat was wrecked just off the coast and a number of people on that boat drowned. That's the reality of life for so many people, isn't it? And often for us as well. And perhaps you're going through some such thing yourself at the moment. But we're told here that we've got this hope of trusting in God himself and in his promises as an anchor of the soul, sure and steadfast. And so the picture, in reality, when we connect with God, it's much more like this. Right? Absolute safe haven, a safe harbour where we are connected to God and to his promises. And we can absolutely trust him to look after us. Now there's a neat little twist because it says that hope enters into that within the veil, that is in the most holy place of the tabernacle, where the forerunner is for us entered, even Jesus, made a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And you might just remember, there's a neat little twist here, because you might remember how the high priest, the manslayer, was in the city of refuge only until the death of the high priest. And when the high priest died, it was like a trigger for the manslayer had to pack up and head home. And he was, of course, to some risk if his village wasn't willing to forgive and to move on. Well, here we're told we're in this city of refuge and the high priest is a high priest forever. In other words, what is different about these promises of God, completely different from what was under the law, because here we've got someone there working for us who will never die. And that, of course, is the Lord Jesus himself. And Hebrews is full of encouragement from this. Just to pick a couple of quick examples, just turn back a couple of pages to Hebrews 2, verse 17. It's talking about Jesus here, and it's saying the whole chapter is really explaining why Jesus came as a man. And it tells us in Hebrews 2 and verse 17, wherefore in all things it behoved him to be his brethren, like one of us, in other words, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. Because he's one of us, he understands, and that's why he's merciful and loyal. In that he himself hath suffered being tempted. Wow, the experiences we go through, the negative moods that we experience, the negative emotions, the crises we have, Jesus has been there and done that. He knows exactly what it's like. Exactly. It happened for him as well. He suffered being tempted. He is able to succour them that are tempted, to give us strength. So we need to connect with him, don't we? And draw on his power and on his wisdom as we move forward through life. We need a living relationship with him because that is why he is there. Have a look at Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Let's come forward a page or so. Again, and there's passages like this all the way through Hebrews. I'm just taking these two examples of why it's such a powerful thing for Jesus to be alive, to be working for us. He's busier than ever. He's got all the power of the universe at his fingertips. That's what we're told in Matthew and Peter and Revelation, a number of places. Angels and authorities and powers being subject unto him. He's got the scroll of history. He's in control. And this is what he's doing with all that power and all that time. Seeing then that we have a great high priest, Hebrews 4 verse 14, that has passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. For we don't have a high priest who can't be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. We don't have somebody remote and distant and inhuman. He was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. So, whatever it is that sort of you've experienced, or whatever uncomfortable thoughts or emotions you feel in your heart, the kind of things maybe you don't even share with close friends. You just feel a bit awkward about the fact that they're even there inside you at all, and that thought crossed your mind. Jesus has been tempted in all points, like as we are. Right? He knows what it's like. He's never given into it, but he knows what it feels like to be under that kind of pressure in every way. He was totally human. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We're going to someone who knows what it's like for us, knows how we tick, and wants to help. Right? What greater encouragement could we have? Hebrews is full of that, and so is all of Scripture. So make the connection with the Lord Jesus and make sure that in life you are talking with him and drawing down on his wisdom and power as you move forward through life. Now, just a couple more minutes before we wrap up. Such a great promise, such a great opportunity calls for a great response. What can I do? If we've received sanctuary, asylum, refuge, we ought to reach out to others and offer it to them. So I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts about how you can reach out to other people and offer this same safe haven, if you like, in life to them. In the Bible, actually, we have examples of refugees. I don't know if you've thought about it like this, but essentially the whole nation of Israel leaving Egypt were in exactly that position. I remember seeing once hung up outside a church on Portrush Road, Jesus was a refugee. It's absolutely true. Right? He was, wasn't he? Because in Bethlehem, there was the threat from Herod to end his life, and Joseph and Mary had to hurriedly pack up, guided by God, and head off to Egypt, where they were for a number of years, living on charity and Joseph's hard work in a foreign country. Jesus was a refugee. What would happen if he got to the border and there was a steel fence and barbed wire keeping him out? Well, God provided for him, didn't he? It's part of the story of Israel too. I don't know if you recognise this picture at all, but this was the Haganah ship Exodus, 1947, bringing, I think, 4,500 people to Israel from what had been Nazi Europe, only a year or two after the war. Look at the state of the ship. It's amazing they even made it to the coast of Israel, but on the international waters, they were intercepted by 6 British ships. They were boarded, the captain was clubbed to death, other people were killed or injured. Finally, they were allowed to land in Haifa Bay, where they were promptly returned to Cyprus to live in a refugee camp for years in squalor. It's not just part of the story of Israel, but for Palestinians, for Rohingya Muslims, for people all over the world, this is a reality today. In fact, 65 million people are living as refugees in tent camps or in displaced persons camps around the world. It's a staggering number, isn't it? Nearly 3 times the population of Australia. And these are people who have left home because they've been chased out or they're in fear of their life. Their country has been racked by war and they've got nowhere to go. So it really bears thinking about that if God has offered us this asylum, this sanctuary, this safe haven, this refuge, we've got to be willing to reach out and offer that to other people as well. And there may be things that we can do to make people feel welcome in our space too. And it's not just about these sort of big issues that sort of work their way out on the world stage. We can certainly make a difference by practical action. But it's also about what we do in life day to day, isn't it? Come over to Matthew chapter 25, where I want to finish tonight. It starts with very simple things. Right, from where I sit up here on the platform, I can look out at the audience. There's a number of people who are sitting on their own tonight. Why? It shouldn't happen, should it? We need to be bigger than that. And that means every one of us needs to lift our eyes, look around, see the needs and be willing to just step back and create a space and welcome people into our circle and give them the chance to fit in and to be part of Suburban. It starts with simple things like that. And of course, there's much more that we can do as well. Let's just have a look at Matthew chapter 25 and finish there, because this is the spirit the Lord Jesus wants to see in all of us. He's not looking for big heroic acts that make spiritual headlines. He wants small practical actions that make a difference to other people every day. That's what he's looking for. That's what he will judge us on. And so he says in verse 34 of Matthew, "Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come ye blessed." Right, there couldn't be a greater sense of security and satisfaction and significance, those words from Jesus, could there? "Inherit the kingdom, prepared for you from the foundation." And he goes on to give the reason for. Here's why I'm making you this generous offer, says Jesus. Because I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you took me in. I was naked, you clothed me. I was sick, you visited me. I was in prison, you came to me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungry, thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger and took thee in, or naked and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick or in prison? If Jesus said that to us, that would be our reaction, wouldn't it? We've never met you before, Jesus, among us. We never did these things for you that you're telling us of. We don't feel that it's right. You should give us credit for such actions when we've never done anything of the kind. Answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. So the things he's talking about are very simple things, aren't they? How hard could it be over supper tonight, for example, to make space for someone who's obviously on their own and invite them into our circle? Share some food, share some drink, ask them what they're doing in life. That's easy. And Jesus is saying, good, that's the sort of thing I want. It's not hard, is it, to give someone a meal or give someone a drink. These do. To take in a stranger, to offer someone a shirt, to spend a little bit of time to go and see them when they're sick or struggling. Just about every person in this room is able to do those things. And that is what he's asking us to do. And so I just want to finish by underlining that point. Let's make sure that our life, our families, our friendship circle, our suburban young people's group is a city of refuge for everyone who needs it and who comes here with those objectives in mind. Let's reach out to people and offer to them the sanctuary, the asylum, the refuge, the safe haven that God